This Russia-NATO proxy war in Ukraine, the focus is always on the military conflict, but it's also an economic war. Indeed, as we learned in the beginning of this, at least in 2022, the goal and the initial assumption was that the NATO countries could break the Russian economy relatively fast, that is isolated in the international system, put crippling sanctions, and some expected that this, could be done by the weekend almost. But obviously, this did not play out as expected. So I guess starting with a broad question before digging into the details, what was the economic strategy? I guess the assumptions it rested on, and why didn't it succeed?
Well, I think there were two at least issues that the Western world, which is Western Europe mostly, the EU and the United States, did not assess correctly. I don't think there's any amount of spinning that's going to erase a very clear sense that they underestimated the ability of the Russians to wage a conventional military war, and they overestimated the ability of economic sanctions to be a powerful weapon in the event that the military didn't work out. And they had, unfortunately, miscalculated on both counts. They underestimated the Russian military potential, and they overestimated the impact sanctions can have, and so they've lost the war. And they find it virtually impossible, well, not virtually, they find it impossible to recognize this misjudgment. When people go into war, they should know that wars have a nasty tendency to have outcomes that were not expected, to have failed to take into account one or another resource on either side. And therefore, one of the reasons you don't have a war, besides all of the obvious political, moral, physical costs, is the uncertainty. And it is a terrible mistake not to give to uncertainty the respect it ought to have. And nothing illustrates that better than what we see now. The Russians are a much larger country than Ukrainians, so there's an obvious advantage in manpower that the Russians bring to such a conflict. That should have slowed people down. But nowadays, when we spy on one another with satellites and so on, to misunderstand that the Russians have more missiles and have more drone capability, and even if they didn't have it in February of 2022, they have the capacity to enlarge their production. And that's well known, or should have been well known. And that made the whole military thing dubious. And they understood that because really from the beginning, the Europeans and the Americans were willing and able to keep increasing the quality and the quantity of military support. The history of sanctions is mostly a history of failure. And that's documented. There are books, I've read them. There are articles, I've read them, about sanctions, asking the logical question, did the sanction achieve the objective that was stated for it? And there's a pretty strong consensus that sanctions may be a burden, sanctions may entail some costs for their objects, but they very rarely achieve anything like a decisive outcome. And that makes me wonder why this extraordinary confidence in the West that these sanctions would have the effect. We live in a different world economy. It is radically different from what it was 20 years ago, and even more different from what it was in the second half of the 20th century. At that time, the United States dominated the flows of capital, the exports in the world, the imports in the world, the loans. I mean, it didn't matter. The dollar was the sovereign global currency, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is no longer true. And nothing has replaced it in the West. There has been something that has risen while the economic importance of the United States and its allies in Western Europe, the G7, if you want to think of it that way, that decline of the G7 has not stopped. It's continuing as I speak to you, and the rise of an alternative continues to be as badly underestimated as was the military capability of Russia and the overestimate of the sanctions. And I'm talking about China and the BRICS. What Russia did was turn to China and the BRICS. Russia, remember, is a founding member of the BRICS and an important part of it, heaven knows. And they turned to their partners, above all China and India and Indonesia and others, and they turned to them for extraordinary help in offsetting both their military problems and the sanctions. And from everything I can tell, sitting here in New York as an American, the strategic planning under both Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump did not acknowledge, did not count on, did not foresee what the BRICS could bring to the Russians in this time around military and sanctions. And, you know, if you can't sell oil and gas, if it's a crucial export, as it is for Russia, if you can't sell it to Western Europe, but you can sell it to India, China, Indonesia, what's the power of the sanctions? I mean, it makes no sense at all. You can't do it. And I think you're watching the slow, and I am stunned by just how slow it is. It wasn't that long ago that Mr. Trump gave a news conference and a reporter asked a question about the BRICS, and he dismissed it. That's not an important matter. Well, all I can tell you is, as a professional economist looking at the world as I have been doing all my life, it's about the most important thing I can think of in terms of changing the economic conditions. And here's my final point. We could talk about sanctions, and I can tell you in detail how the BRICS helped, but it might be even more important for people to understand that the effectivity in terms of the war in Ukraine that was misunderstood, the effectivity of the BRICS, is now being similarly misunderstood, because the BRICS is going to have an enormous impact on whether the tariff program of Mr. Trump ends up being good for the United States or a disaster for the United States. It is surprising, in a way, that the United States would continue to say, as Mr. Trump says even over the last 2 days, that the war is a negative experience for the Russians economically. It's strange for the United States, because our history in the last century was a history in which going to war in World War II is what overcame the Great Depression. It was an economic boost. The rate of growth, GDP, soared. The mass of people unemployed were put to work. Half of them in the military, the other half producing the equipment the military used. And something like that is what happened in Russia. They got a stimulus out of this war,